Welcome, everyone. I was hoping I had a little Beijing opera bell and I could bell us to order. My name is 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁，诸葛亮的葛，大小的小，伟大的伟。I am the director of the Manchester China Institute and the 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁 Chair of the Manchester China Institute and professor of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester. Thank you for coming to attend this event. It's actually part of a renewed Chinese culture lecture series that is jointly being sponsored by MCI, the Manchester China Institute, and the brand new 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁 Chinese Culture Gallery, which has just opened in the Manchester Museum, just down Oxford Road, if you haven't seen it yet. It literally just opened this past Saturday. It's already packed. I'm really thrilled about that. And we have several people here who were instrumental in making that happen. It was a huge amount of work, very exciting that the Lee Gallery is open. Just a couple of quick announcements before I introduce our speakers today. In addition to the Lee Gallery being opened, which I strongly encourage you to attend, I think it's next week we're launching the 5th iteration of the UK-China International Photography Competition. For those who have not heard of it, what that is it invites people who have smartphones in China and the UK, which I believe would be close to 1.5 billion people. At least 1.5 billion, of whom probably 2/3 or more have smartphones. Any of them are eligible to use their smartphone to take a photo on the theme of family treasures and to submit it over the next 2 months. And the winners, there are various prizes, but the idea behind this competition is one that resonates with both the Lee Gallery's mission and the Manchester Museum's mission more broadly, also the Manchester China Institute's mission, which is to promote understanding, and in particular to use the emotion of empathy and utilize perspective taking as a way to promote empathy and mutual understanding. And we believe that photographs are particularly powerful in this sense because photographs transcend linguistic divides, and by juxtaposing photographs taken in China with photographs taken in the UK, you really reveal our common humanity. And we believe that's extremely important, especially at a time when the media in the UK, the media in China are just constantly talking about conflict and differences between Brits and Chinese. And of course, we're all human beings, and we need to be constantly reminded of that, and that's what the photography competition tries to do. Will, was there something else from MCI I needed to mention? No? Good. So now I get to the reason you guys are here. Let me briefly introduce Sunny Xin Liu is the English. Liu Xin, Liu Xin. Xin is a senior lecturer at our neighbor, 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗁 University of Central Lancaster. And she has written a book which is incredibly timely. We didn't even ask you to write this book in time for the opening of the Lee Gallery, because the theme is again similar. The way the Lee Gallery tries to achieve its goal of promoting mutual understanding is through focus on interpersonal encounters. And that's exactly what Xin's book does. It focuses on Sino-British encounters. In her case, prior to the Opium War, the Lee Gallery, I think, has a little bit of a broader span, but same goal. So Liu Xin is professor of public history and broadcaster. Oh, broadcaster is Michael Wood. I guess that was a preview of their bios. Sorry, Liu Xin has 2 BA degrees from China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, so 外交学院 in Beijing, and an MBA from the University of Central Lancaster. And her PhD was in China's Cultural University, also from 𝗘𝗃𝗁. And she's been a senior lecturer in the School of Humanities, Languages, and Global Studies since 2008. Her research area is multidisciplinary, covering public diplomacy, cultural studies, media and communications, and China's relations with the West. And Michael Wood is an English historian, broadcaster, and professor of public history at the University of Manchester. From exploring international history with undergraduates to being a patron of the Manchester Histories Festival, leading historical field trips and giving public lectures, Professor Wood has become an emblematic figure at the University of Manchester and a great friend to the Manchester China Institute. Michael has been a judge, I think, from the very beginning in our international photography.
Can't wait for the next one, actually, Pete.
Yes, I'm hoping with the theme of family treasures that it'll bring out some interesting submissions.
Especially from China.
Yes,
yeah.
I think that's right. And many of you may find Michael's face familiar because he's produced and starred in many BBC documentaries, not just about China and including the story of China, but many others as well. So we're very fortunate to have him here. And they're going to be engaging in a conversation about Xin's book, and I think it's going to be nicely balanced in terms of thinking about Chinese and British perspectives, which I think, again, is very nicely timed with the opening of the Lee Gallery. So I'm finally going to shut up. Please join me in a welcome round of applause for our
Thanks a lot, Pete. Actually, talking about that photographic competition, from my experience of traveling around China, when you ask people these days to show their family treasures, unbelievable things come out that they've saved over decades of destruction, and there it is, saved sometimes for hundreds of years. I mean, really, it's going to be an interesting time. It's a really great pleasure to be here tonight to welcome Sunny's fascinating book. Actually, we've been in touch about this from some years, haven't we? We'd hoped that we would make a documentary series about it.
Still hoping.
But we're still hoping. The funny thing is, how on the Chinese side they dragged their feet. We'll talk about that later. The book's called Anglo-Chinese Encounters Before the Opium War. You might think that you're going to get a detailed analysis of diplomatic and commercial relations over those couple of hundred years before the Opium War, but actually this book is about much, much more than that. It's about, culture, food, scholarship, what the French call mentalities. It's really about one of the key relationships in the making of the modern world, namely that between Britain and China. And the issues and the questions it raises are still centrally relevant to what's happening today, especially thinking about the way that the British and the West have perceived China over this long period of time as the great, rich, extraordinary civilization that they recognized in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then the increasingly disparaged, out-of-time empire that emerges in the historiography of the West in the 19th century. So everything in the book then reflects the present. And Sunny, you begin near the front of the book with this: no other country is so deeply embedded in modern China's narrative of itself than Great Britain. And bearing that in mind, I'm going to start by asking you, we've got to start where it starts, with the letters of Queen Elizabeth I to the Wanli Emperor. Some of you may not know of such things. Letters written in 1583, 1596, and 1602. The first two letters were published in the Elizabethan age in Hakluyt's Book of Voyages, 1589, 1600. But the third one, and as a Northwestern audience you will be amazed, delighted to hear, turned up in Preston. The original letter in the Lancashire County Archive. So I've got to ask you, first of all, Sunny, tell us the story, how that came to be, and how it kind of set you on the search, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael, for the wonderful words. Yeah, it's quite exciting discovery for me. Yeah, I heard a story about, you told the 3 letters written from Elizabeth I to the Emperor Wanli. Been actually using the story in my teaching of final year class. Yeah, the material I used are in Chinese. They did mention the last letter, dated in 1602, survived in excellent condition. But they've been very vague about where it is today. They just mentioned in Chinese a British museum. So I tried the British Museum, British Library, National Archives, no luck there. So I thought I'll just need to dig it up a bit more. And then I came across a source from New Zealand, actually. They're saying it's actually in the Lancashire Record Office. That was the old name of today's Lancashire Archives. At that moment, I couldn't believe it. I said, wait, what? In Little Preston? And 10 minutes from my office, literally. Yeah, 10 minutes walk. I couldn't believe it. And I went there immediately with the handout I used in class, because there was a picture in the printout. So I went to the reception and just asked, I'm actually trying my luck here. Is this letter here? And they said, yes, it is. I said, can I have a look at it? They said, yes, of course. So 5 minutes later, I laid my eyes on this most hidden gem. In my eyes, it's so precious, in Preston, Lancashire Archives. At that moment, I truly felt I was touching history. And I also felt I was given a piece of string that I already have some stories like pearls on the table. I can see myself making them into a necklace. So this is the book, it's my end product of that necklace.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Got to ask you a second question then. Why was Elizabeth writing to the Wanli Emperor?
Yeah, why? At that moment, Britain has been a latecomer in trading with China, centuries behind the Portuguese, when they started the settlement in Macau in 1570s. And also centuries behind the Italians and other European neighbors. They've been sending missionaries to China, and also towards the end of the 16th century, like Maturity was there the same year when Elizabeth wrote the first letter, 1583. Yeah, so the Britain has been they've been trying to trade, and they realized, they are behind. So they thought, well, perhaps we should find a way, maybe a shortcut, to break the Portuguese monopoly. Because at that time, you have to, when you want to go to sail to China, you have to go to Lisbon first. Yeah, you have to get their approval. That's something Britain wouldn't like. They said, okay. The world, the globe is round. We'll try to maybe go to the north. So that's why Elizabeth, he's got some, people very adventurous, and try to propose we can explore a northwest passage or northeast passage, and they tried, and they failed, So they keep trying, the third one, they went as far as Hudson Bay near Canada, but then they met with frozen seas that they couldn't get through. So they came back, and the letter was brought back.
So none of these letters actually reached the Wanli Emperor then?
Not reached the Wanli Emperor, but the interesting thing is, centuries later, when Elizabeth II visited China as the first and only, ruling sovereign of Britain, that's in 1986, she brought a photocopy of the second letter, as a special gift to the Chinese government, saying, like, my ancestor have been trying to deliver this letter centuries. Now it's finally being hand-delivered by myself. That was the letter 1596, and there was also a letter to the Lancashire Archives. They did try to bring the 1602 letter because it was such a highly ornamented, as you can see from the picture.
Gorgeous.
Every time when M for Majesty appeared, it's elevated and it's gilded in gold. Just to show the highest respect. But then at that point, they realized the letter has been brought to China 1 year earlier for a special occasion to celebrate the anniversary of Chinese Historical Archive. As I said, it would be better if the Queen delivered the letter. So she picked the second one.
Now, so Coming into the 17th century then, we've still not got real contact, have we? But can you just tell us briefly, 1637, the English did attempt to establish a foothold in Canton, didn't they?
Yeah. That's, when I started research, I mean, the idea started with the letter, and then I started the research, but at that point, when the history of Anglo-Chinese relations was discussed, mostly started with the Macartney Embassy in 1792. And then I found actually Macartney Embassy was not the first Anglo-Chinese encounter, physical encounter. I'll tell the incident in 1637 in a minute. And he was also not the first British person ever met a Chinese emperor. And he himself was not even the first ambassador sent by the British government. So what happens to those real first? That really fascinated me. It's surprisingly under-researched and understudied in both worlds, both in China and in England. For example, I found the first physical encounter that happened in 1637 during the Ming Dynasty. It's John Weddell, but it's not sent by the British government, was not even sent by the EIC. It's more like a private adventure.
East India Company.
Yeah. Not by the EIC, but the court. Not by them yet. There was some. I think the King Charles even personally have some investment there. It's just exploration. So unfortunately, they don't speak the language, they don't understand the rules, and lots of complications because the Portuguese wouldn't want them to share the piece of cake. They just want to protect their own interests. So they were not very lucky, but that first encounter also included the first record of British people tasting Chinese tea. And that happened in China. Not like other sources I read, it appeared in Samuel Pepys's diary much later. It's actually happened there and then in China. And the most amazing thing is, it ended in a military skirmish, in the same waters that staged the consequential Opium War almost exactly 2 centuries later. This was 1637, and they have to sign the pledge that they will never come back to China, because, So.
Now I know we're supposed to stick strictly to our subject tonight, but you've just raised something there which is really interesting, is how did we become a tea-drinking nation?
Right, that's interesting because, again, when you mentioned at the very beginning in the book, I did say no other country was as deeply embedded in the Chinese history and identity as British, because the Opium War defined the official start of Chinese modern history. So in that sense, it's deeply embedded. But I would argue perhaps fewer people would realize when Britain entered its modern history in the 18th century, China was also deeply embedded in its identity as a tea-drinking nation. Because at that point, tea was considered as both civilizing and civilized. So drinking tea is a symbol of being civilized and being going into this modernity. And again, Britain was the later ones, so it started with, I think the Dutch EIC started the tradition. It was so expensive. It became more popular among British tradition is after the Portuguese princess married King, again brought the tradition there because she's got used to drinking tea. She couldn't spend a decent day without tea. So when she was married here, she brought many crests of tea to go with her, and that started the tradition in the High Court. And then, but over the time, I think the interesting thing is now you talk about British tea. For nearly 2 centuries' time, the only place you can have tea and also porcelain teaware to drink tea from are both from China. But when Britain became so strong and powerful and modern, became the definition of modern civilization, seeing Chinese tea as from China and drinking tea in Chinaware, this vision of otherness blended with a very strong feeling of nationalist self they don't like that idea. Yeah, so eventually they developed, British tea.
Yeah. In the end, it came down to builders and Yorkshire.
Yeah.
Now, the portrait of the 18th century that you give in the book, I find absolutely fascinating because the cultural encounters actually begin a bit earlier, don't they? 𝗱𝗲𝘁𝗶𝗹𝘀 is 17th century. Chinese scholar coming to catalogue the Chinese books in the Bodleian Library. But just give us a little portrait of that period in the 18th century, which I suppose is paralleled by the philosophes in France and the Diderot and all these people, where China is viewed as the great civilization which has come down from antiquity with its immense history and its richness of culture. And they give full credit to that, don't they?
Yeah.
And some of the, I knew about William Jones's interest in the Indo-European languages, but I had no idea that he even attempted to learn a bit of Chinese.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that attempt, so which stories should I start first? Maybe 𝗱𝗲𝘁 and William Jones as another story.
Yeah.
So 𝗱𝗲𝘁 was the very first, if I say known named Chinese person visited UK, because there are people who came before him, and they did mention someone who can speak Latin, but that person is dead, so there's no name. Yeah. So in that sense, 𝗱𝗲𝘁 came to visit in 1685. Yeah. So he came at a very good time because over the years after the first generation of a Jesuit missionary in China, like started with Matthew Ricci, he's not the first one, but he was the one started to be allowed to stay in Beijing, and start to send reports back to Europe, he wrote a lot about China. So by the time 𝗱𝗲𝘁 actually was converted by another missionary, 𝗘𝗃𝗁, if the right way to pronounce 𝗘𝗃𝗁, his French name, because he's from Belgium.
Yeah.
So he spent 25 years in China as a missionary, and he was planning to come back to Europe, and because at that time they've already finished a compilation of Confucius philosophy. It's generations' work for all the missionaries. So he was the, if you say, editor-in-chief in today's language. He was the main contributor. So he brought that back to Europe to have it published in Paris. And also brought along an actual person from China, that was 𝗱𝗲𝘁. So you can imagine the kind of sensation it caused. They've never met a person from China, very decently dressed. The portrait itself is so big, it's 2 meters tall and 1.5 meters. That's the size. Just to capture even the physical feature at that time was quite curious. People never seen someone from China. So he toured Europe. He was met with all the monarchs like French King Louis XIV, and also the Pope, the Queen from Sweden, and then he came to England. He was quickly invited by Thomas Hyde to Oxford, because by that time, Oxford have got maybe more than 70, I don't know the stock we have in John Rylands' library about books from China. At that time, they've got over 70 books from China, but bought as curiosities, not really as books to read, because they don't even know which way, this side up, for example. They don't even know how to hold a book. Because traditional, Chinese books, actually was written vertically. You read from right to left. They have no idea. What is all Greek? It's all Chinese. So it's just like a curiosities. So 𝗱𝗲𝘁 spent the whole summer there, helping Hyde just to catalog all the books, so that they at least they know this is the book about Chinese agriculture. This is about literature. This is about calendar and everything. And 𝗱𝗲𝘁, I think the best part is before he left, he asked for a favor from Hyde. He said, could I was given some maybe European scientific instruments like microscope, telescope. Can I bring those things back to China? They would be so pleased. Yeah. So I think that's the best part. That's real exchange. Unfortunately, Chen died on his way back to China. He never really made his way back to China. That's a shame. But there were some slides from my book as illustrations. Yeah. The other good thing is, they actually Shen Fuzong also became the first Chinese person who taught Chinese language abroad. Yeah. And Hyde is his first teacher. First student. So perhaps the first, again, known British person who ever tried to learn Chinese, both spoken language and also characters. Yeah, there are some scrap papers they use for teaching. Just 3 meals a day.
The box of treasures in the British Library still survives.
Yeah, the treasure box is still there. That was amazing. Yeah. And also, before Hyde retired, he's got his official portrait made, and he insisted, he was holding the scroll, as a scholar, and he insisted that one has to have Chinese characters on it to prove I'm the one who can read the language.
So they saw this as this was an important beginning. Hyde saw this as an important beginning in cultural exchange, didn't he?
Exactly.
And in the 18th century, some of the stories you tell are just fantastic, I think. Yeah. I mean, William Jones, the famous linguist who of course, identified the Indo-European roots of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and everything. His reception of Chinese is really interesting, isn't it? You quote him saying that this is a civilization where the great texts of this civilization that we're just starting to receive now, Confucius and the philosophers, are entirely equal to our tradition of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, entirely equal. This is a civilization which in every way we should consider are equal and we can learn from. But even on a personal level, I think the contacts in the 18th century, I was very taken by Goldsmith saying the Chinese people are really just like us, we English, which I've often thought that in travelling actually, the sense of humour, the sociability. The 18th century reception is very interesting, isn't it, Sunny?
Yes, because they're so rare, actual person who really came to England from China. Every single one of them amazed, the educated elite, because they mingled with, the Royal Society and people. I think interesting, for example, just a very quick word about Chen Fuzong. He was just an average, I think, Chinese. I mean, he was converted, so he studied Latin, so he could commute in Latin. But he didn't do the imperial examination, for example. And then he was treated as a scholar here. That was how he was remembered. Yeah, I don't think he would be recognized as a scholar in China. And here, because he knows maybe like average person's knowledge about that was considered as so knowledgeable everything. So he was considered a scholar, including other people who came after him, like Huang Yadong is the one who worked with William Jones. Also, he came at a very young age. But he's very, I think he has that kind of thirst of knowledge. That's one of the reasons drove him here. Quite different from Chen Fuzong. As a convert, he was brought here by the Jesuit missionary. But the next story, Huang Yadong, he came by himself. It was just at that kind of curiosity. I want to know what kind of, because there was a trading between Britain and China. He even wanted to gain some advantage for his personal trade. So that was quite different, the younger generation. And again, because he's versatile, he knows knowledge about botanical, medical science and porcelain making, not as an expert level, but again, he was treated, as finally we've got someone from China, tell me about this, tell me about that, and William Jones, his interest is in the language. It's quite impressive because his Chinese knowledge is just reading characters or decoding characters, if I put it that way. He couldn't really speak the language, but he was so fascinated by the Book of Songs. he translated some of the stanzas, and in two ways. One is a literal translation, one is a poetic one. Yeah, it was very much into that. But there are limitations for his language level, so he would like to work with Huang Yadong. Like, that was the perfect situation, like today, if we can work together, to translate some classics, we bring the knowledge together. Unfortunately, Huang Yadong was already back to Canton by that time. He said, I'm too busy with my business. So he declined the offer. That's a shame. But he did reply in very perfectly written English, and also sent William Jones some books about Confucius. And that letter, I think so far, was the first English letter written by a Chinese man. Yeah. 𝗱𝗲𝘁 also have lots of letter exchange with Thomas Hyde. Those are the first letters of a learned nature, but they are written in Latin, because 𝗱𝗲𝘁 doesn't speak English.
I mustn't delay us, but there are so many fabulous highways and byways and ramifications of the book. I was terribly touched by the fact William Jones's insight sometimes, even though he didn't have the linguistic knowledge of Chinese, he had spent so long quarrying early Vedic texts in India, the Rig Veda, and looking at the origins of the Indo-European languages, making comparisons with Homer and the Rig Veda. And it's so fascinating that he should have gone to the Book of Songs, because there you have the oldest miscellany of Chinese verse, some of which goes back to the late Chang, probably, before 1000 BC.
Yeah.
And they're incredibly they're powerful, wonderful, archaic songs, aren't they? Festivals and love and work and stuff like that. And the fact that through his Chinese interpreter he was able to perceive that this poetry lay at the root of a poetic tradition which was older than Homer, older than the Iliad and the Odyssey. I found that really fantastic.
Because of that, he said Chinese civilization, it's just the top among the East and unequal with the Western civilization. He see them as equal values, the two countries, and also,
Wonderful. I'm so sorry to ask to be so swift on all this, but are we all right for time, by the way?
Maybe another 10 minutes before
we probably must turn to what you portray in those early chapters is the way that the West came to understand China and understand it as a very great ancient civilization that had come through to the modern world. And even in the 18th century was seen almost as a paradigm of a great ancient civilization. The rule of the philosophers, Matteo Ricci called it, didn't he? Viewing Western countries in a rather critical light compared with what China had achieved in its body politic and its social policies and everything else. But that changes in the 18th century, doesn't it? So maybe we can zoom on, and I wish we had several talks like this to really ask you in detail about this. Let's zoom on to this, what you call the mission impossible, which is the Macartney embassy of reached China in 1793. And this is seen as in both cultures probably, as a cardinal moment, isn't it? Do you want to just tell us briefly about Macartney?
Macartney's story, I think, is most well known, perhaps. Before I wrote the book, I thought, well, maybe I'll focus on other things, but I still ended up having the largest chapter because it is so much. The story is too so amazing, and I tried to. Because you mentioned the changing perceptions of China, I just tried to tell the story in synchronic comparison between China and Europe at the time. Just tried to put the story of China back into world history. So at first, 𝗱𝗲𝘁's time, China was a romanticized, utopianized version. It was imagined. The perfect model of political statecraft. Everything was just put as a model for the West to emulate. By Macartney's time, there was a changing, definitely, because he was the one actually said that back in 1773, like Britain was the vast empire that the sun will never set. I didn't know it come from him, because it came known as a nickname for Britain, is the sun never sets.
I mean, he'd been a governor in South India, he'd been ambassador to Russia. Of all the people in the 18th century, McCartney probably had the widest experience of other cultures across the world, the Caribbean. A very acute mind.
Yeah, but that sense of pride you can feel, and then for a good reason, because when he visited China, there's already there's already the Industrial Revolution, and it's after the Age of Enlightenment, and those are the two major things I think set the divergence. Because when you have the Age of Discovery, for example, China was not lagged behind. Actually, 𝗘𝗃𝗲's voyage was actually almost a century earlier in terms of the Age of Discovery. But his voyage was not for the purpose of discovery of new knowledge. But we're not talking about 𝗘𝗃𝗲. But after that, there's too many things. After that, when we have the Age of Enlightenment in China, we still have this literary inquisition. That in modern days it's called speech crime. People are not encouraged to have different thinking, new thinking. You could get yourself in prison or even killed. So everything has to be the one way, to ancestors' way. So, but in Europe, the Age of Enlightenment, that was scientific progress. That was liberal, political sources were all at that time, and was the gap. Was accelerated by the Industrial Revolution. So it's in the same year. On the one hand, you have this Industrial Revolution, and on the other hand, we have this restrictive Canton system. You are expanding. The same year when Canton system came into practice, Britain captured Bengal. It starts expanding the whole global, trading network. So you see the contrast there. But when McCartney visited, obviously Britain was on the rise, but Qing China at that time was also in its heyday. Qing was 150 years old, very stable. So the High Qing, we look at the three emperors, 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗁, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. So it's Qianlong's time. Now looking back, we can see a clear curve. At that time, people don't have that foresight or hindsight, but we can see one is really on the rise, one is on the top already. But the thing is, I think McCartney's embassy, they have made some, when I say mission impossible, is looking back, I think he made lots of wrong assumptions. He didn't really understand what is 天下, what is the Chinese understanding of the world. Here we think, well, you talk about the world, everyone is on the same page, we all know what we're talking about. But Chinese people don't talk about the globe geographically or the world politically. They talk about 天下 ideologically. It's boundless. It's just China is the only country that was the emperor. It's called, the emperor called himself the son of heaven.
All under heaven.
And son of heaven to rule everything under heaven. It's the celestial sort called. So China does not see itself as part of the world. It formed a world of its own. So it's just not, we're talking about the same thing. The other wrong assumption is about trade. British people think trade is for an island nation. It's essential needs. It just assumes everyone thinks the same, because trade is for mutual benefit. From the first letter from Queen Elizabeth I, when I read it, I said, oh, such a modern language used. We are here to build friendship, trade for mutual benefit, reciprocity. All those words are in the letter dated in 1583. I find it hard to believe. But Chinese people, the emperor does not think trade is that important, because we are an agricultural economy, self-contained, large empire. We have a Grand Canal that links North and Western China. We have eternal circulation, completely self-sufficient. So trade is not as important as the priority is security and stability.
Still the same.
It's still the same.
Still the same.
Many things remain the same.
So McCartney thought that, sorry to interrupt you, but McCartney thought first of all, that they could change China.
Yeah.
But he thought that this change would be to China's benefit.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You brought up one thing. I tried to make the difference, even if Britain was as a latecomer, centuries behind its European neighbors. But when it appeared on the stage and joined the game, he did not appear as just another Western Ocean country. He became the first one who want not just to exchange goods with China, but want to change the rules of exchange. And Britain was the first country to challenge the quota system and the yi, in Chinese word, which refers to foreigner as barbarians. Yeah. To the point, in 1858, at the end of the Second Opium War, there is the Treaty of Tianjin. There was a special article in that treaty just to remove the use of yi, and also to just make it clear, Western ceremony will be performed by our envoys. No more koto. And also all foreign diplomatic official communications must be written in English. And Chinese become a translation. English has to be the definitive version, yeah. But that's all achieved after McCartney was
and apologies again.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've just carried away a bit.
I wish we'd got hours, but we've only got a limited time. And it's so fantastic. But just let's try and bring this to a close. We probably won't have time to talk about the Amherst embassy. But when McCartney went back to Macau, ready to sail home, he wrote that famous judgment on China in 1793, that it was a kind of breezy nautical metaphor that would have come easily to the British, that China was like a crazy old man of war, which a succession of able commanders had managed to keep afloat for the last 150 years. But as long as there was somebody gifted on the bridge, it might carry on. But it was impossible that it could continue in the long term. And it would hit the rocks and things would fall apart. This crazy man of war could not be rebuilt from the bottom again. Now, was that judgment unfair? True?
Yeah, he's got lots of judgment with.
And given that the very rapidly out of that embassy and the Amherst embassy will come to the Opium War. The judgment of still in China today. You encounter this from official sources and school textbooks and everything. The century of humiliation begins with that, out of which China is now rising. Can you, impossible task, but in just a couple of minutes, put this last phase, if you like, after your book, into a context for us?
Right, you talk about the century of humiliations, and we talk about McCartney Embassy as the mission impossible, and then I later dubbed it as the mission of humiliations. So for Britain, the failure is just one mission of humiliations. What it means for China, it started a century of humiliations. And after that, when we talk about it was China, if you look at China today, was it really rebuilt on the same bottom? Yeah, that's a tricky question, yes or no. Obviously, China no longer have emperors. We had a revolution. We have a revolution after 1911, and it's a modern state, and China opened itself up after 1978, and then that's how we've seen China today. It's completely rebuilt. Perhaps on a different bottom because the system changed, or not, because the way you can still see, when China claimed itself as a continuous civilization for 4,000 years, it kind of recognized there's continuity from imperial China to today. So how do you, well, on the one hand, you're so proud, continuous, never stop. On the one hand, we're completely different China. So there are like genes there still. For example, the state control and this kind of hierarchical structure, that remains unchanged.
I mean, I remember, was it Joseph Leveson who said a lot of sinologists looking at China in the 1960s, who had studied the Ming autocracy or the Qing autocracy and despotism, thought the Communist Party had replicated, uncannily replicated, I think was his expression, the old order, you know.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which...
Yeah, it just sorry, I know just reminded me of one thing I read. I also quoted from the book, from 𝗱𝗲𝘁, again, the French author. I think that's a very astounding word he said. He said McCartney and 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗁 was not dead, he's still living among us. Perhaps they are immortal. So I guess that's better, than myself.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you think we ought to... Well, I wish we'd got another hour here. This is very unfair. But maybe we ought to throw it open to the audience.
Yes.
Really great, Sunny. Thanks.
Yeah, so
really
thank
great.
you. Thank you. Really
Actually, before the Q&A, please join me in a round of applause. I think our job is to make sure that the ghosts of McCartney and 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗁 do not live on. We need to do a better job of communicating, obviously, than they did. Anyway, who wants to ask the first question? Anyone?
While you're thinking, can I add one thought?
Sure.
Which is there's been a very interesting trend in historiography written by Chinese historians in recent years about, and I don't know what the word is in Chinese, what 𝗱𝗲𝘁𝗶𝗹𝘀 calls monarchism. And he thinks that China has not escaped this idea of the single great, all-powerful, all-beneficent ruler. And that, and published a number of great works of history on this. He died in 2018, I think, and published them in China at that point. But it is a debatable question.
Well, he passed just before Xi reappointed himself to a third 5-year term.
Any thoughts?
Yes, in the back. Yeah.
I think that is, we're talking about Western historiography of China and how on one stage China is viewed as a kind of utopian civilization, and later, sort of more due to changes in the West, China's then viewed as kind of backwards. I was wondering, when Chinese are looking to the West, what are they thinking of the West in the same period? What's their perception in that direction?
Was that how the West saw, how China saw the West?
It's the changing perception of China to the West.
Yeah.
Right, okay, thank you very much
how
for
China saw the West in that period.
Yes, it's interesting because I call myself adopt a mirror approach in writing this book. I did talk about that, even until today. I mean, the book just finished in 1840, I mean, the time frame. Even today, I think, the changing perception of China towards the West is have a very similar process. The book is mainly about the changing perception of West towards China from imagined, and then admired, and then studied, and then re-examined, and then criticized, and then despised. That's more like to summarize the process. I think I can see it almost happening the other way around. After the Opium War, China. I mean, before that, because of the lack of direct, exchange, we all have the similar image of imagining each other. So that was fair enough. And after the Opium War, China started to send students study abroad. There was a popular, Western learning done by Chinese. So was also gone through that stage, studied. And then re-examined, after China's rise itself, and then perhaps criticized, these days, I don't think it will go to that stage, but it's very similar. When you see China's rising up, I talk about the reversal being other, us and other, who is the superior one, inferior one, the civilized one, the uncivilized one, but also the reversal of learning curve, by the way, McCartney's embassy, the letter of credence he carried to China by King George III, he said, well, the main purpose of this mission is not to seek, commerce, wealth, not to conquer your land for sure, mainly to increase our knowledge. That was made, yeah, in that letter. Just, I mean, to make it sound better, yeah. But that was generally shows at that point, yeah, Britain was so eager to learn everything about China, yeah. But of course, because before that, the knowledge is not actual knowledge, it's more like imagined. And then after, disillusion and gone through that cycle just mentioned, I think China is going through a similar pattern, like it or not, yeah.
There's some debate, I mean, you will know all about this, Pete, but there's some debate recently in Chinese intellectuals circles that the opening up has gone too far, apparently. I'm told by Chinese friends, and that...
well, the political trend is clearly towards closing.
Yeah,
and it was
closing down
accelerated
again.
with COVID.
Yeah.
And this is actually an important inflection point. Will we return to the trend of opening that persisted for decades after Deng Xiaoping initiated it?
Yeah.
Or is this new kind of mini trend away from opening, will it continue even after COVID? That's a big, big question mark. Question?
Yes, thank you. Talking about the reciprocation between China and the West, surely one of the big contrasts is that non-Chinese interest in China has often been marked by a wish to conquer. And I think that goes all the way back to the Jesuits. There was a sense, not from all the Jesuits, but there was a sense from some Jesuits that what they should do in China was exactly what they had done in Latin America. That these were heathen people, and it was a God-given right for them to go and conquer China. So there's a letter that goes to the Pope in the 16th century saying, wouldn't it be a good idea to conquer China? And although there has been, on both sides, a lot of respect, a lot of wish to try and understand, a lot of wish to try and live in peace, it seems to me that the Chinese view has never been characterized by conquest, whereas the Western view has very often been characterized by conquest. So I think that's one imbalance which is fundamental to understanding the relationship between the West and China.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Thank you very much for that comment.
Ricci, there's a very interesting passage in Matteo Ricci's diary, in which he says what's very interesting is that Chinese do not have ambitions to conquer other nations. They have never gone out to conquer other nations, even though he says their nation is so populous, they have such an enormous army. He says, whereas the Western nations, Ricci says this, are consumed by the idea of domination.
And greedy.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting observation, actually. And there's a difference between East and West, I think. There's similar observations made about India, classical India, that they don't attempt to go beyond their borders. There's some deep cultural revulsion at the idea of conquering and enslaving other peoples. Different, you want control of your own diaspora, perhaps. But I mean, I've never looked at that in detail, but it is a really interesting observation by somebody who knew.
Yeah. Also want to add one insightful observation by Medhurst. He was also a missionary to China. He said China did not expand by conquering, but expanded by being conquered. That's very interesting. Talk about, we look at Han China, and then the Mongol Empire, and then back to Han people's ruling, and then to the Qing and the Manchu Empire. They said those, other cultures, they could militarily conquer China, but subdued by China culturally. Yeah. So that was his observation of history.
Just a little intervention to just remind us that Chinese are human too. We're all human, and therefore there are good people and bad people, and people who get angry and people who are happy. And the Chinese Empire has expanded and contracted, just like many Western empires have as well. Any final questions? Yes?
Yeah, we've had the West coming down from the north. You have the other Westerners, the Russians. And I wonder if there's any difference in the view of the Chinese had or have of the Russian interaction, because although they think of them as a Western country, I think it was slightly different the way they made contact.
Right, yeah. I think I would say not slightly different, vastly different, yeah. Because, yeah, I just briefly mentioned Macartney was not the first British person to see a Chinese emperor. That person is actually John Bell. He visited China during 𝗘𝗃𝗁𝗁 reign as a member of the Russian embassy. It's quite interesting, yeah. So it was 1719, yeah. So he wrote a book, yeah. I think that shows a lot, the contrast, yeah. I don't think Britain really get it, yeah. He said, you know, for that embassy was relatively maybe more successful because they managed to have the negotiation. For example, in the 𝗘𝗃𝗁𝗁 ceremony, they said we're going to exchange, yeah, because they think, well, when you send ambassador to our country, and then he can obey, just you know, respect our court, and then we can do, you know, reciprocally. That would work because, yeah, the Qing did send embassies, yeah, like to Russia. That wouldn't happen to Britain. They would not want to send anyone to Britain, yeah. So that kind of reciprocity, and also because Russia was also a land empire, yeah, you know, share a very long border with China and militarily very strong, and they see that as a potential risk to China's national security. So China managed to have the very first relatively called equal treaty signed in Chinese history was with the Russian, yeah, 𝗍𝗃𝗁𝗁, I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, the Treaty of 𝗍𝗃𝗁 to settle the border. So they take the Russian very seriously, and in return, the Russian managed to have to install a representative in Beijing. For 2 years. This is something Britain wants to achieve, yeah. We want to have exchange, you know, of embassy, we want to have like an embassy permanent in China. And then they didn't realize, yeah, at that point, the Qing's view of the world, the importance of the power, almost in direct proportion to the size of the country. In Russian, it's big enough, you know, we are neighbors, we can't move, you know, we take it very serious. But Britain, at some point, is just a couple of stones in the ocean. Yeah, it's, and also, you know, why would we care that much? And they can't claim, you know, have any threat to to conquer the territory. So they didn't take the British seriously at all, yeah.
There's an album of paintings of foreign peoples produced in Qianlong's reign, isn't there, in the 1760s?
Yeah.
And when it comes to the British, there's something that they've obviously copied from some book, and it says the British, God, can I remember it now? Yes, British women like to wear very tight dresses, and they take snuff, and they're always drinking.
Yeah, there is a picture.
It's a very swift dismissal.
Look, are you there? Can you show one of the pictures? Just Michael just mentioned, yeah. Just to take a second, yeah. Because the British man did carry a bottle. Sorry, it's not this one, yeah. We should do the other way around towards the end of. These are some slides I used in previous talks, yeah. Sorry. And that was the tea drinking.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
We might have just passed.
Yeah, this too, yeah. So the British man, 𝗍𝗃𝗁𝗁.
Go back, yeah.
Yeah, that was the woman. There was a description. Yes, actually nothing interactive. It was all very good. It was in 1751. Yeah.
Just briefly, since the last question was on Russia, if I could toot the horn of my colleague Ed Pulford in the slightly darker baby blue sweater in the back, has just published an article last year in Current History on Sino-Russian relations. There's a lot of misunderstanding of that relationship that surrounds fears about some kind of Sino-Russian alliance against the West. And it is very important to understand this history, and in particular, the history of Russian imperial aggression against China and the Chinese response to that. It's not one big happy friendship between the panda and the bear, so You can sleep a little better if you read Ed's piece. But with that, our time is up. Please join me in another round of thanks and applause for
Thank
No,
you.
you were
Thank
great,
you so much.
really great.
I'm sorry, I
Very
just
interesting.
carried away.
Couldn't come with